Robber baron is a derogatory metaphor of social criticism originally applied to certain late 19th century American businessmen who used unscrupulous methods to get rich. Usage: the term robber baron derives from the Raubritter, the medieval German lords who charged nominally illegal tolls on the primitive roads crossing the lands, larger tolls along the Rhine River, all without adding anything of value, but instead lining the pockets at the cost of the common good. The metaphor appeared as early as February 9, 1859, when the New York Times used it to characterize the unethical business practices by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Historian T.J. Stiles says the metaphor conjures up visions of titanic monopolists who crushed competitors, rigged markets, and corrupted government. In the Greed and Power, legend has it, they held sway over a helpless democracy. Charles R. Geiss says, in a Darwinist age, Vanderbilt developed a reputation as a plunderer who took no prisoners. Hal Bridges said that the term represented the idea that business leaders in the United States from about 1865 to 1900 were, on the whole, a set of avaricious rascals who habitually cheated and robbed investors and consumers, corrupted government, fought ruthlessly among themselves, and in general carried on predatory activities comparable to those of the robber barons of medieval Europe. The term combines the pejorative senses of criminal and aristocrat. Hostile cartoonists might dress the offenders in royal garb to underscore the offense against democracy. The critic's 1860s-1920s. Historian John Tipple has examined the writings of the 50 most influential analysts who used the robber baron model in the 1865 to 1914 period. He argues, the originators of the robber baron concept were not the injured, the poor, the faddists, the jealous, or a dispossessed elite, but rather a frustrated group of observers led at last by protracted years of harsh depression to believe that the American dream of abundant prosperity for all was a hopeless myth. Thus the creation of the robber baron stereotype seems to have been the product of an impulsive popular attempt to explain the shift in the structure of American society in terms of the obvious, rather than make the effort to understand the intricate processes of change. Most critics appeared to slip into the easy vulgarizations of the devil view of history, which ingenuously assumes that all human misfortunes can be traced to the machinations of an easily located set of villains, in this case, the big businessmen of America. This assumption was clearly implicit in almost all of the criticism of the period. 1930s-1970s. American historian Matthew Josephson further popularized the term during the Great Depression in a 1934 book. Josephson alleged that, like the German princes, American big businessmen amassed huge fortunes immorally, unethically, and unjustly. The theme was popular during the 1930s amid public scorn for big business. Historian Steve Fraser says the mood was sharply hostile toward big business. Biographies of Mellon, Carnegie and Rockefeller were often laced with moral censure, warning that Tories of industry were a threat to democracy and that parasitism, aristocratic pretension and tyranny have always trailed in the wake of concentrated wealth, whether accumulated dynastically or more impersonally by the faceless corporation. This scholarship, and the cultural persuasion of which it was an expression, drew on a deeply rooted sensibility, partly religious, partly egalitarian and democratic, that stretched back to William Jennings Bryan, Andrew Jackson and Tom Paine. However, a counterattack by academic historians began as the Depression ended. Business historian Alan Nevins challenged this view of American big businessmen by advocating the industrial statesman thesis. Nevins, in his John D. Rockefeller, The Heroic Age of American Enterprise, took on Josephson He argued that while Rockefeller may have engaged in some unethical and illegal business practices, this should not overshadow his bringing order to the industrial chaos of the day. Gilded Age capitalists, according to Nevins, sought to impose order and stability on competitive business, and that their work made the United States the foremost economy by the 20th century. In 1958, Bridges reported that the most vehement and persistent controversy in business history has been that waged by the critics and defenders of the robber baron concept of the American businessman. Richard White, historian of the transcontinental railroads, stated in 2011 he has no use for the concept, which has been killed off by historians Robert Weber and Alfred Chandler. He notes that much of the modern history of corporations is a reaction against the robber barons and fictions. Recent approaches. In the popular culture, the metaphor continues. In 1975, the student body of Stanford University voted to use robber barons as the nickname for the sports teams. However, school administrators disallowed it, saying it was disrespectful to the school's founder, Leland Stanford. In academia, the Education Division of the National Endowment for the Humanities has prepared a lesson plan for schools asking whether robber baron or captain of industry is the better terminology. They state, in this lesson, you and your students will attempt to establish a distinction between robber barons and captains of industry. Students will uncover some of the less honorable deeds as well as the shrewd business moves and highly charitable acts of the great industrialists and financiers. It has been argued that only because such people were able to amass great amounts of capital could our country become the world's greatest industrial power. Some of the actions of these men, which could only happen in a period of economic laissez-faire, resulted in poor conditions for workers, but in the end may also have enabled our present-day standard of living. This debate about the morality of certain business practices has continued in the popular culture, as in the performances in Europe in 2012 by Bruce Springsteen, who sang about bankers as greedy thieves and robber barons. During the Occupy Wall Street protests of 2011, the term was used by Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders in his attacks on Wall Street. He said, "We believe in this country, we love this country, and we will be damned if we're going to see a handful of robber barons control the future of this country." The metaphor has also been used to characterize Russian businessmen allied to Vladimir Putin. List of businessmen who were labeled as robber barons. The people here are listed in Josephson, Robber Barons, or in the cited source, John Jacob Astor, New York; Andrew Carnegie, Pittsburgh and New York; William A. Clark, Butte, Montana; J. Cook, Philadelphia; Charles Crocker, California; Daniel Drew, New York; James Buchanan, Duke, Durham, North Carolina; Marshall Field, Chicago; James Fisk, New York; Henry Morrison Flagler, New York and Florida; Henry Clay Frick, Pittsburgh and New York; John Warngates, Texas; J. Gould, New York; Edward Henry Harriman, New York; Charles T. Hine, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, California; Mark Hopkins, California; Collis Potter, Huntington, California; Andrew W. Mellon, Pittsburgh; J.P. Morgan, New York; John Cleveland Osgood, Colorado; Henry B. Plant, Florida; John D. Rockefeller, Cleveland, New York; Henry Huddleston Rogers, New York; Charles M. Schwab, Pittsburgh and New York; Joseph Seligman, New York; John D. Spreckles, California; Leland Stanford, California; Cornelius Vanderbilt, New York; Charles Tyson Yates, Chicago; James J. Hill, St. Paul, Minnesota;